In 1700, something impossible happened to human language. Across Europe, dozens of languages that had evolved slowly for millennia suddenly standardized overnight. Dictionaries appeared containing words that should have taken centuries to develop. Grammar rules were codified simultaneously in nations with no contact. And when we examine manuscripts claimed to span the entire 18th century, the handwriting, spelling, and linguistic structures remain suspiciously identical. Language does not work this way. Evolution leaves traces. Dialects diverge gradually. Spelling shifts incrementally across generations. Yet when we compare documents from 1700 to documents from 1800, we find almost no linguistic drift, as if only 20 or 30 years passed instead of a full century. Meanwhile, the supposed evolution from 1600 to 1700 shows changes so dramatic they suggest centuries of missing development compressed into decades. This documentary uncovers the linguistic impossibilities of the 18th century timeline. Using comparative philology, dictionary analysis, handwriting forensics, and suppressed scholarship on chronological anomalies, we expose evidence that the 1700s were either fabricated entirely or compressed from a century into mere decades to fill a gap in manufactured history. What if languages evolved naturally until around 1650, then jumped forward artificially? What if the standardization programs of the so-called Enlightenment were not cultural movements, but evidence-planting operations? And what if the 18th century exists on paper but never actually happened in real time? Explore the dictionary conspiracy, the handwriting that never changes, the missing linguistic bridges, the overnight standardization of grammar, and the scholars who were silenced for questioning why French from 1710 is identical to French from 1790. If you've ever noticed that old books from the 1700s are suspiciously readable, if you've questioned why language evolution suddenly froze for exactly 1 century, or if you've sensed that our timeline contains phantom years inserted to hide a chronological collapse, this investigation will prove that the 18th century is the greatest linguistic fraud in history. What if an entire century never happened? What if the 100 years we call the 1700s, the age of enlightenment, the era of revolutions and reason, existed only on paper, inserted into history to conceal a gap, a rupture, a missing chapter that someone desperately needed to fill? This is not speculation. This is evidence. Linguistic evidence. Because language does not lie. Language evolves according to immutable patterns. Phonetic shifts occur gradually. Vocabulary expands incrementally. Spelling standardizes across generations, not overnight. Grammar rules emerge through cultural consensus built over centuries of use. These are laws as predictable as geology, as measurable as erosion. And yet, when we examine the languages of the 1700s, these laws are violated systematically. French from 1710 is nearly identical to French from 1790. English handwriting from 1720 looks indistinguishable from 1780. German dictionaries published in 1730 contain the same standardized spellings as those from 1795. It is as if language froze for exactly 100 years, then resumed evolving normally afterward. But languages do not freeze. They cannot freeze. Every generation introduces variations. Every decade produces new words, new pronunciations, new grammatical constructions. A century of natural linguistic evolution should leave unmistakable traces. Yet in the 1700s, those traces are absent. The century that supposedly gave us Voltaire, Rousseau, Mozart, and the American Revolution left almost no linguistic fingerprint. As if it never had time to develop one. As if it was compressed. Or fabricated entirely. This is the most damning evidence yet that our timeline is a construction. And once we examine the patterns closely, once we trace the linguistic impossibilities across languages, nations, and so-called decades, the conclusion becomes inescapable. The 1700s were not a century. They were a placeholder. A narrative patch. A manufactured buffer inserted to hide something far more disturbing about when our modern world actually began. Let us begin with the most glaring impossibility. The simultaneous standardization of multiple languages across Europe during the early 1700s. In 1650, European languages existed in chaotic diversity. French had no official dictionary. English spelling varied wildly from writer to writer, sometimes within the same document. German existed as a fragmented collection of regional dialects with no unified grammar. Italian was a patchwork of mutually unintelligible local tongues. Spanish varied so dramatically between regions that royal decrees had to be translated for different provinces. This is normal. This is how languages behave without mass communication, without printing standardization, without centralized education systems. Languages diverge. They fracture. They evolve locally. Then, according to the official timeline, something miraculous occurred. Between 1700 and 1750, nearly every major European language underwent simultaneous standardization. The Académie Française published its first dictionary in 1794. Samuel Johnson published his English dictionary in 1755. The Real Academia Española formalized Spanish in 1713. German grammar was codified by Johann Christoph Adelung in 1774. On the surface, this seems like coordinated intellectual progress. But when we examine the actual linguistic content of these dictionaries, contradictions emerge. The dictionaries do not document gradual evolution. They present fully formed standardized languages appearing as if from nowhere. Words that supposedly took the entire century to develop are already present in the earliest editions. Spelling conventions that should have required generations of consensus are imposed immediately. This is not how standardization works. Real standardization is messy, contested, incremental. It takes centuries, not decades. The English language required 400 years to move from Chaucer's Middle English to Shakespeare's early modern English. Yet we are expected to believe that between 1700 and 1800, English underwent almost no change at all, despite being spoken across expanding global empires, despite contact with dozens of foreign languages, despite population explosions and social upheaval. The timeline does not support natural evolution. It supports fabrication. When we compare manuscripts claimed to be from 1710 with those from 1790, the handwriting styles are nearly identical. The spelling conventions match. The grammatical structures show no drift. It is as if the same generation of scribes produced documents across an entire supposed century. But even more disturbing is what happens when we examine the jump from 1600 to 1700. The linguistic differences are enormous. Late 16th century English is difficult for modern readers. Early 17th century French requires translation even for native speakers. Yet somehow, between 1690 and 1710, languages made a leap that should have taken 200 years. And then, from 1710 to 1800, they barely changed at all. This pattern is backwards. This pattern is impossible. Unless the 1700s were compressed. Unless what we call a century was actually 20, maybe 30 real years, stretched on paper to fill a chronological gap. Now we must examine the dictionaries themselves, because they contain evidence of temporal fraud. Samuel Johnson's Dictionary of 1755 is presented as the culmination of decades of scholarly work documenting the English language as it existed in the mid-1700s. Yet when we analyze the word entries, something deeply suspicious emerges. The dictionary contains words that should not have existed yet. Technical terms from fields that were not formalized until the 1780s appear in definitions from 1755. Words borrowed from colonial languages that England had not yet made significant contact with are listed as established vocabulary. Grammatical constructions that supposedly evolved in the late 1700s are treated as standard in the 1755 edition. Either Johnson was a prophet, or the dictionary was backdated. Either he documented words before they existed, or the dictionary was compiled later and assigned an earlier publication date to create the illusion of a century-long linguistic timeline. The same pattern appears in French. The Académie Française Dictionary of 1794 presents itself as the product of continuous work throughout the 1700s. But when scholars compare early drafts to the final publication, they find almost no evolution in the language itself. The vocabulary is static. The grammar is frozen. It is as if the entire century of work produced a document that could have been written in 1710 and published in 1790 with only minor cosmetic changes. This is not natural. Languages spoken by millions of people across expanding empires do not remain static for 90 years. New technologies introduce new words. Trade brings foreign vocabulary. Social change produces new expressions. Yet the French of 1794 looks indistinguishable from the French of 1720. Why? Because they are the same language. Because the supposed 80 years between them never actually happened. Because the 1700s were fabricated, and the dictionaries were created retroactively to fill the gap with plausible-looking linguistic development. Even more damning is the evidence from German. Johann Christoph Adelung's grammar of 1781 standardizes German spelling and syntax. But when we examine German texts supposedly written between 1710 and 1770, they already follow Adelung's rules. The standardization appears before the standardizer. The grammar exists before it was supposedly codified. This is temporal impossibility. This is evidence of backdating. This is proof that documents were created in the late 1700s or early 1800s and then assigned false earlier dates to construct a fictional linguistic timeline. Handwriting is one of the most reliable chronological indicators. Paleographers can date manuscripts to within decades based on letterforms, pen pressure, writing implements, and cultural conventions. Handwriting styles evolve visibly across generations as tools change, education systems shift, and aesthetic preferences develop. Yet, when we examine handwritten documents from across the supposed span of the 1700s, we find something impossible. The handwriting does not change. Letters from 1715 look identical to letters from 1785. The same letterforms. The same pen strokes. The same stylistic flourishes. Official documents from different supposed decades show no paleographic drift. It is as if every scribe across 70 years was trained in precisely the same school, using precisely the same methods, with no variation, no innovation, no generational shift. This violates every principle of paleographic analysis. Handwriting styles and living languages change noticeably every 20 to 30 years. Compare genuine manuscripts from the 1600s to those from the early 1700s, and the differences are dramatic. Letterforms change. Abbreviations shift. Ligatures evolve. This is normal. But from 1700 to 1800, the evolution stops. Handwriting freezes as if time itself paused for exactly 1 century. Forensic document analysts who have examined 18th century manuscripts privately admit that the consistency is anomalous. In academic settings, they attribute it to strong standardization efforts or cultural conservatism. But privately, away from institutional pressure, some acknowledge that the handwriting evidence suggests a much shorter real-time span than the official century. One researcher, whose work was suppressed before publication, conducted ink and paper aging tests on manuscripts supposedly spanning 1710 to 1790. The chemical composition of the inks was nearly identical. The paper showed aging consistent with a 20 to 30-year range, not 80 years. When confronted with these results, archivists claimed the documents had been restored or reinked at some later date. But there are no records of such restoration. The explanation is a cover story invented to dismiss inconvenient evidence. Even more telling is what happens when we examine handwriting transitions between centuries. The shift from 1600s handwriting to 1700s handwriting is abrupt, dramatic, unmistakable. As if a new system replaced an old one suddenly. Then, from 1700 to 1800, handwriting barely changes. And then, from 1800 to 1900, dramatic evolution resumes. The pattern is clear. The 1600s were real. The 1800s were real. The 1700s were inserted between them. A placeholder century. A fabricated timeline filled with documents created all at once, backdated to different supposed decades, but betrayed by their paleographic uniformity. One of the strongest pieces of evidence for a compressed timeline is the absence of linguistic bridges. Transitional forms. Intermediate stages of evolution. When a language evolves naturally across a century, we find gradual shifts. Early forms transition into middle forms. Middle forms transition into late forms. The process is continuous, traceable, documentable. We can see the path from one state to the next. But in the 1700s, these bridges are missing. Take English pronunciation. Historical linguists claim that the Great Vowel Shift, which transformed Middle English into modern English, continued through the 1700s. Certain vowel sounds supposedly shifted gradually across the century. Yet when we examine poetry, which relies on rhyme and meter to reveal pronunciation, we find no evidence of gradual shift. Poems from 1710 rhyme the same way as poems from 1790. The supposed vowel changes leave no trace in the very documents that would be most sensitive to phonetic evolution. This is impossible. If pronunciation changed across 90 years, poets would have adjusted their rhyme schemes. Early century rhymes would not work in late century speech. Yet they do. The poems are mutually intelligible across the entire supposed span. As if the language did not actually change. As if the 90 years never provided time for phonetic drift. The same pattern appears in French. The transition from 17th century French to 18th century French supposedly involved significant changes in nasal vowels, consonant clusters, and liaison rules. Yet when we analyze theatrical scripts, which must be performed aloud and therefore preserve pronunciation, we find that scripts from 1720 could be performed with the same pronunciation as scripts from 1780. The linguistic bridge is missing. The evolutionary intermediate does not exist. In Spanish, the supposed loss of certain consonantal distinctions across the 1800s should be traceable through poetry and legal documents. Yet the documents show the distinctions already gone in 1710 and still gone in 1790, with no intermediate stage. The change either happened suddenly before the century began, or it never happened at all because the century was compressed. Linguistic evolution without intermediate forms is like biological evolution without fossils. It suggests not gradual change, but instantaneous replacement. It suggests that what we call the 1700s was not a century of slow linguistic development, but a single generation backdated across multiple fabricated decades. Spelling is one of the most volatile aspects of language before standardization. In living languages without authoritative dictionaries, spelling drifts constantly. Writers spell words phonetically based on personal pronunciation. Regional dialects produce regional spellings. Even the same author will spell the same word differently across documents. This is why Shakespeare's name appears in dozens of variant spellings in contemporary records. This is why medieval manuscripts show wild orthographic variation. This is normal pre-standardization behavior. Yet in the 1700s, spelling freezes. According to the timeline, standardized spelling emerged gradually through dictionary publication and educational reform across the century. Early 1700s texts should show more variation than late 1700s texts. We should see the gradual imposition of orthodoxy. We should find transitional documents with mixed spellings, some following old conventions, some adopting new standards. We do not find this. Instead, we find that documents from 1710 already follow the same orthographic conventions as documents from 1790. The standardization appears fully formed at the beginning of the century. As if someone created spelling rules in the late 1700s, then backdated documents to earlier decades and made sure they all followed the same system. This is particularly obvious in printed books. Printers supposedly had economic incentive to standardize spelling to reduce errors and costs. Yet when we examine print runs supposedly from different decades, the spelling consistency is too perfect. different printers in different cities producing books in supposedly different decades all follow identical orthographic rules. This level of coordination should be impossible without centralized authority and instant communication. Yet both were absent in the early 1700s. The only logical explanation is that the books were all printed during a much shorter real-time period, perhaps 20 years, and then assigned different publication dates to create the illusion of a century-long timeline. Even more damning is the evidence from manuscript collections. Archives contain letters supposedly written by the same individuals across spans of 40 or 50 years. Yet their personal spelling never changes. An aristocrat supposedly writing in 1720 spells exactly the same way as he supposedly writes in 1760. No drift. No evolution. No natural variation. Human beings do not write this way. Spelling habits change as people age, as they read new materials, as language around them shifts. Yet these letters show perfect orthographic consistency across supposed decades. As if they were all written during a single brief period, then dated to different years to construct a biographical timeline that supports the fabricated century. When we assemble all the linguistic evidence, a clear pattern emerges. The 1700s were not a century. They were compressed. What actually happened occurred in perhaps 20 to 30 real years but was stretched on paper to fill a 100-year gap in the timeline. Why would this be necessary? Because something happened around 1650 to 1700 that disrupted chronology. A catastrophe. A reset. An event so significant that it left a gap in historical continuity. And when the survivors attempted to rebuild civilization and reconstruct history, they found themselves with a problem. The gap was too large to ignore. Too obvious to dismiss. So they filled it. They fabricated a century. They created documents. They backdated publications. They assigned false dates to real events that had occurred rapidly during the actual short transitional period. They standardized languages overnight, and then pretended the standardization took 90 years. They printed dictionaries and claimed they documented evolution when in fact they imposed conformity. And they did this well enough that for 300 years, almost no one questioned it. Scholars accepted the timeline because it came from authoritative sources. Archives preserved the backdated documents. Educational institutions taught the fabricated chronology. And anyone who noticed the linguistic impossibilities was dismissed as a fringe theorist. But the evidence remains. Language does not lie. And the linguistic signature of the 1700s is not the signature of a century. It is the signature of rapid, artificial imposition. A linguistic reset. A standardization program executed in decades, not generations. This explains why French from 1710 is identical to French from 1790. Because both are actually from the same narrow real-time period, perhaps 1780 to 1800, just assigned different false dates. This explains why English handwriting does not evolve across the supposed century. Because all the documents were created during a much shorter span and then distributed across fabricated decades. This explains why dictionaries appear fully formed. Because they were not documenting natural evolution. They were creating artificial standards and then retroactively claiming those standards had developed gradually. The 1700s were a fabrication. A chronological construction. A placeholder century inserted to hide the real timeline of post-catastrophe recovery. We are not the first to notice these impossibilities. Throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, linguistic scholars, chronology researchers, and historical analysts raised questions about the 1700s. Their work was suppressed, dismissed, or buried in obscure publications. Anatoly Fomenko, the Russian mathematician, built an entire alternative chronology partly on linguistic evidence. He demonstrated that medieval texts supposedly separated by centuries contained identical linguistic structures. He showed that chronological dating based on astronomical references contradicted linguistic dating. He argued that much of ancient and medieval history was fabricated or compressed. The academic establishment rejected his work, but his linguistic analysis remains unrefuted. Emanuel Velikovsky, though focused on catastrophism, also noted chronological anomalies in ancient texts. He pointed out that languages supposedly separated by vast stretches of time showed suspicious similarities. His work was viciously attacked, not because his evidence was weak, but because it threatened foundational historical assumptions. Even mainstream philologists have quietly acknowledged problems. In private correspondence, in footnotes to obscure papers, in unpublished manuscripts, scholars have admitted that the 1700s present linguistic puzzles that standard evolutionary models cannot explain. They note the missing transitional forms. They observe the orthographic consistency. They question the timeline. But they never publish these doubts. Because to question the 1700s is to question the entire framework of modern chronology. It is to suggest that the Enlightenment, the foundation of our contemporary intellectual identity, might be a fabricated narrative. It is to imply that the timeline we teach children is ALIE.so. The questions are buried. The scholars who ask them are denied tenure. The research is dismissed as pseudoscience. And the fabrication continues, defended not by evidence, but by institutional authority. Yet even authority cannot erase linguistic law. And the linguistic law is clear. The 1700s violate every principle of natural language evolution. They present as a compressed, artificially standardized period, not a century of organic development. The final question is motive. Why would someone fabricate an entire century? What purpose does the 1700s serve in the timeline? The answer lies in what comes before and after. The 1600s were a period of catastrophe. Wars. Plagues. Social collapse. Documented upheaval. The 1800s were a period of rapid industrialization, global empire, unprecedented technological advancement. But between them is a gap. A discontinuity. A rupture in the pattern. If we remove the 1700s, if we compress that supposed century into the 20 or 30 real years it actually represents, then the 1600s connect directly to the 1800s. The catastrophe leads immediately to the recovery. The collapse is followed immediately by the rebuilding. The timeline makes sense. But this creates a problem for official history. Because it means the modern world emerged not through gradual Enlightenment progress across a civilized 18th century, but through rapid post-catastrophe reconstruction. It means our institutions, our nations, our cultural identities are not centuries old. They are much younger. They were built in haste by survivors, not cultivated slowly by philosophers. The 1700s were inserted to hide this truth. To create the illusion of continuity. To make it seem as though European civilization evolved naturally from Renaissance to Enlightenment to Industrial Revolution, when in fact there was a break. A reset. A moment when the old world ended and the new world was built from its ruins. The fabricated century serves another purpose. It distances us from the catastrophe. It places the rupture safely in the past, beyond living memory, beyond the reach of oral tradition. If the reset happened in the late 1600s, and we are now in the 21st century, that is 300 years of separation. Enough time for the truth to fade into myth. But if the 1700s were compressed, if the real reset happened in the late 1700s or early 1800s, then we are only 200 years removed. Close enough that evidence survives. Close enough that architectural remnants remain. Close enough that linguistic patterns still reveal the fraud. This is why the fabrication matters. This is why they needed a placeholder century. To create distance. To obscure the timeline. To make the reset seem ancient when it was actually recent. And language, precise, measurable, governed by immutable laws, betrays the deception. If the 1700s were fabricated to hide a chronological gap, then something happened during that gap. Something significant enough to require concealment. Something that disrupted continuity so severely that the timeline had to be rewritten. The linguistic evidence points to a sudden, global standardization event. Around the late 1600s or early 1700s, languages that had been diverging for centuries were forcibly unified. Dialects were suppressed. Orthography was imposed. Grammar was codified. And this happened too quickly to be natural. What could cause such rapid linguistic standardization? A political force? A technological revolution? Or something more catastrophic? Consider the historical context. The late 1600s saw global upheaval. Wars. Famines. Unexplained population declines. Cities abandoned. Trade routes disrupted. And then, in the early 1700s, a sudden reorganization. New institutions. New governments. New educational systems. New religious structures. As if the world was being deliberately rebuilt according to a plan. Linguistic standardization is a tool of control. Unified language means unified governance. When you standardize spelling and grammar, you standardize thought. You create a population that can be administered efficiently. You eliminate regional variation that breeds independence. The rapid standardization of European languages in the early 1700s looks less like cultural evolution and more like an imposed program. A coordinated effort across nations to create linguistic uniformity. But coordination on that scale requires centralized power. Power that should not have existed in the fragmented political landscape of the early 1700s. Unless the political landscape was not fragmented. Unless the early 1700s were actually a unified post-catastrophe rebuilding period. A moment when surviving elites reorganized civilization according to new principles. And one of those principles was linguistic control. They standardized language. They created dictionaries. They codified grammar. They imposed orthography. And then they backdated the process, spreading it across a fabricated century to make it seem like natural evolution rather than artificial imposition. The catastrophe they are hiding is not just geological or climatic. It is civilizational. A collapse so total that when the world was rebuilt, language itself had to be reset. And the 1700s exist to conceal that reset, to make it seem gradual when it was sudden, natural when it was engineered. We have traced the evidence. We have examined the patterns. We have followed the linguistic laws to their logical conclusion. And the conclusion is undeniable. The 1700s were not a century. They were a fabrication. A chronological insertion designed to fill a gap in the timeline left by catastrophe and reconstruction. The linguistic evidence proves it beyond reasonable doubt. Languages do not freeze for 100 years. Handwriting does not remain static across supposed generations. Standardization does not occur simultaneously across multiple nations without coordination. Dictionaries do not appear fully formed documenting words that should not yet exist. Spelling does not achieve perfect consistency overnight. Yet all of this happened in the 1700s. All of it. Every linguistic impossibility concentrated in a single supposed century. And the only explanation that accounts for all the evidence is that the century is false. Compressed. Fabricated. What we call the 1700s was actually 20 to 30 real years, probably occurring in the late 1700s to early 1800s, during which a rapid linguistic standardization program was executed. Documents were created during this short period and then backdated to different supposed decades to construct a fictional timeline. Dictionaries were compiled and assigned false publication dates. Manuscripts were written and given fraudulent chronological attribution. And the entire apparatus of academic history accepted this fabrication as truth. Why? Because to question it is to question everything. To admit that the 1700s were fabricated is to admit that our chronology is unreliable. That our institutions are younger than they claim. That our cultural identity is built on lies. That a catastrophe occurred far more recently than we have been told. And that those who rebuilt the world afterward deliberately obscured the timeline to hide their role in the reconstruction. But the evidence does not care about institutional comfort. The evidence does not bend to academic authority. And the linguistic evidence is clear. The 1700s violated every law of natural language evolution. They present as an artificial construct, not an organic century. The phantom time hypothesis is not speculation. It is linguistic fact. And once we accept this fact, once we acknowledge that a century was inserted into our timeline, the entire narrative of modern history collapses. Because if they could fabricate 100 years, what else did they fabricate? If they could compress decades into centuries and expand years into generations, where else is the timeline distorted? The 1700s are the proof. The linguistic smoking gun. The undeniable evidence that our history has been rewritten, our chronology manipulated, our timeline constructed to serve a narrative rather than reflect reality. And now that we see it, we cannot unsee it. The fabrication is exposed. The phantom century revealed. And the question is no longer whether the timeline was altered, but what really happened during the years they tried so desperately to hide.